In the endless white of the Arctic tundra, Nukka pulled his seal through the snow, following tracks that led him farther from home than usual. The ice beneath his feet groaned with each step, thick and solid from months of brutal cold. Then he saw it, something pale and unnatural beneath the frozen surface. He dropped to his knees and brushed away the snow. A woman's face stared back at him through the ice, her skin white as fresh powder, her dark hair fanned around her head like seaweed. Her eyes were open, crystal blue and impossibly clear. She looked as if she had been sleeping, not dead for what must have been months or years. Nukka had seen many things in his 40 winters on the tundra, but nothing like this. The woman beneath the ice was perfect, untouched by decay or time itself. But what was she doing so far from any village, and why did looking at her fill him with such dread? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nukka's bone harpoon trembled against his back as he trudged toward the village, the seal's weight forgotten in his urgency to share what he had discovered. The ancestral weapon, carved from walrus tusk by his grandfather's grandfather, had never behaved this way before. It grew colder with each step, as if something was drawing the warmth from it. The village of Kaktovik appeared through the swirling snow like a cluster of dark spots against the white canvas of the world. Smoke rose from the central lodge, where the elders gathered each evening to share stories and make decisions that affected the entire community. Nukka's breath formed ice crystals in the air as he quickened his pace, knowing that Elder Siku would still be awake. Tending the sacred fire, he found Siku exactly where he expected, cross-legged before the flames, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing light. The old man's eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with wisdom, fixed on Nukka the moment he entered. "You have seen something that troubles your spirit," Siku said without looking up from the fire. "I can smell the fear on you like the scent of a storm." Nukka knelt beside the elder, his words tumbling out in a rush. "There is a woman beneath the ice, 2 hours' walk from the seal-breathing holes. She is preserved as if time stopped around her. Her eyes are open, elder, open and clear." Siku's hand paused over the fire, a piece of dried kelp frozen between his fingers. "Describe her clothing. Describe every detail you remember. Her parka is unlike any I have seen. The fur is white as new snow, but it shimmers like sealskin when wet. There are symbols sewn into the hood, spirals and crescents that seem to move when you look at them. Her boots are made from some animal I do not recognize." The elder's face grew grave. He threw the kelp into the flames, where it hissed and sparked with unusual intensity. "How long did you look upon her face?" "Long enough to see that she does not belong to our time," Nukka admitted. "Long enough to feel that she was looking back at me." Siku rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement. He walked to a carved chest in the corner of the lodge and withdrew a bundle wrapped in sealskin. Inside lay objects Nukka had never seen before, bone tools etched with the same spiral symbols he had described, a necklace of teeth from no animal that walked the earth, and a piece of ice that never melted despite the fire's heat. "My grandfather told me this story." "As his grandfather told him," Siku began, settling back beside the fire. "Long ago, when the ice was young and the spirits walked openly among our people, there were those who chose to bind themselves to the cold rather than accept death's embrace. They became something neither living nor dead, sustained by the life force of others." Nukka felt his harpoon grow colder still, the bone now painful to touch even through his thick clothing. "You believe she is such a being?" "I believe you have found something that was meant to stay lost." Siku's eyes reflected the firelight like dark mirrors. "But the decision of what to do lies with all our people, not with one old man's fears." Word spread through the village like wildfire across dry tundra. By the time the moon reached its highest point, nearly every adult had gathered in the lodge to hear Nukka's account. The children pressed against the walls, their eyes wide with excitement and terror as the hunters debated their course of action. Tulimak, the village's most skilled hunter, argued for immediate action. "We cannot leave her there. The ice will shift with the spring thaw, and she will be lost to the sea. If she is one of our ancestors, she deserves proper burial rites, and if she is something else, challenged Ayana, the village shaman. Her voice carried the authority of one who spoke with spirits regularly. What if disturbing her rest brings consequences we cannot imagine? The debate continued until dawn broke grey and cold over the tundra. In the end, it was Nukka himself who provided the deciding argument. I found her, so the responsibility is mine. But I will not act alone. If we face unknown danger, we face it together as our people always have. Elder Siku bowed his head in acceptance, though his expression remained troubled. Then we prepare for the retrieval. But we do so with every protection our ancestors taught us. And we watch for signs that we should abandon this course. As the villagers dispersed to gather supplies and prepare for the journey, Nukka's harpoon finally returned to its normal temperature. But the memory of its unnatural cold remained, a warning that something ancient and powerful waited beneath the ice. The extraction took 6 men and most of the morning. They worked in shifts, using heated tools to cut through ice that seemed unnaturally thick, as if the cold had concentrated itself around the woman's body. Grandmother Tepesa's walrus ivory amulet, worn smooth by generations of handling, began developing hairline cracks the moment they freed the first section of ice. Tepesa noticed the damage immediately, her gnarled fingers tracing the fractures that spread like spider webs across the protective charm. "The old spirits are stirring," she whispered to Ayana, who knelt beside her examining the woman they had pulled from her frozen tomb. "This amulet has protected our family for 7 generations. Nothing has ever harmed it." The woman lay in the ceremonial lodge on a bed of furs, ice still clinging to her hair and clothing. As the warmth of the fire began its slow work, details emerged that made even the bravest hunters uneasy. Her skin held no trace of frostbite despite being entombed in ice. Her lips retained their color, and when Ayana pressed her ear to the woman's chest, she swore she could hear the faintest whisper of a heartbeat. "Look at her hands," Nukka said, pointing to fingers that seemed too long, too elegant for someone who had lived the harsh life of the Arctic. "And her boots. The leather is worked in patterns I have never seen. These symbols—" He traced the air above markings that seemed to shift in the firelight. Young Casquet, barely 19 and eager to prove his courage, leaned closer to examine the woman's face. "She is beautiful," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Even in death, she is the most beautiful woman I have ever seen." The moment his words left his lips, the temperature in the lodge dropped perceptibly. Breath became visible, and the fire flickered as if a cold wind had swept through the sealed space. Tepesa's amulet cracked completely in half, the 2 pieces falling to the fur-covered floor with a sound like breaking bones. "Step away from her," Ayana commanded, her shaman's instincts screaming warnings. "Now!" But Casquet remained transfixed, his eyes locked on the woman's face. "I had the strangest dream last night," he said dreamily. "I was walking across the ice, and someone was calling my name. A woman's voice, speaking words I could almost understand." Elder Siku moved with surprising speed for his age, grasping Casquet's shoulder and pulling him back from the thawing form. "Dreams can be doorways," he said firmly, "and not all doorways lead to places we want to go." As the hours passed, the woman's transformation continued. Ice melted away to reveal clothing that defied explanation, furs that shimmered with an inner light, bone ornaments carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and jewelry made from materials that belonged to no animal of land or sea. Her hair, freed from its icy prison, spread across the furs like spilled ink, black as the deepest winter night. But it was her breathing that disturbed them most. Shallow at first, then deeper, as if she were slowly waking from a long sleep rather than returning from death. With each breath, the air in the lodge grew colder, despite the roaring fire that now consumed wood at 3 times its normal rate. Tulimak stood guard by the entrance, his hand never leaving his knife. "She is not of our people," he said with certainty. "My grandmother knew every family line in 5 villages. This woman belongs to none of them. Perhaps she is from the inland tribes, suggested one of the younger hunters. Or from across the great water. Ayana shook her head, her fingers working nervously at prayer beads made from carved bone. I have traveled far in my spirit journeys. I've seen the dress and customs of many peoples. This woman's clothing speaks of no tribe that walks beneath the sun. As if responding to their discussion, the woman's lips parted slightly, releasing a breath that turned to frost in the warm air of the lodge. The sound that emerged was barely audible, a whisper in a language that predated any words their ancestors had known. Yet somehow, impossibly, they all understood. Its meaning. She was saying thank you. The fire guttered and died completely, plunging the lodge into darkness, broken only by the pale glow that seemed to emanate from the woman's skin. In that moment of absolute silence, they could all hear it clearly. The steady rhythm of a heart that had not beaten for centuries, now returning to life with each degree of warmth that touched her flesh. Outside, the wind began to howl with a voice that sounded almost human, and the aurora borealis painted the sky in colors that had no names. The village drum began its rhythm at the darkest hour before dawn, though no human hands touched its stretched seal-hide surface. The ancient instrument, carved from driftwood and blessed by shamans long dead, produced a slow, hypnotic beat that penetrated every dwelling in Kaktovik. The sound pulled people from their sleep, not gently, but with the urgent insistence of a warning. Nukka woke to find his young daughter Nayeli standing at the foot of his sleeping furs, her eyes wide and unfocused. "The woman in the ice is singing, Papa," she whispered in a voice that seemed older than her 7 years. "She knows my name." Similar reports came from every family. Children spoke of whispers that only they could hear, words in a language that bypassed their ears and spoke directly to something deeper. The hunting dogs, usually eager for their morning run, cowered in the corners of their shelters, whimpering and refusing to venture outside. Malik, the village's lead sled dog, a massive animal that had faced polar bears without flinching, pressed himself against the wall of his enclosure whenever anyone tried to lead him past the ceremonial lodge. His hackles remained raised, and a low growl rumbled continuously in his throat, a sound of pure, primal fear. "The animals know," Ayana said as she examined the dog. "They sense what we cannot yet accept." The food stores presented another mystery that defied natural explanation. Fish that had been properly dried and stored in the traditional way began to spoil, developing a strange blue-green mold that smelled of seawater and something far less pleasant. Seal meat, preserved in oil and frozen solid, turned black overnight. Even the emergency rations of dried berries and nuts crumbled to dust when touched. But strangest of all were the shared dreams that began on the second night after the woman's arrival. Villagers who had never spoken of such things found themselves experiencing identical visions, walking across endless ice toward a figure that beckoned from the horizon, hearing voices that promised warmth and shelter in exchange for unspecified services. Young Siku, named for his great-grandfather but possessing none of the elder's wisdom, described his dream to anyone who would listen. "She showed me cities of ice beneath the frozen sea, where people lived in palaces carved from glaciers. She said I could rule there, that I could have power over the cold itself. All I had to do was bring her what she needed." "And what did she say she needed?" Ayana asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Breath," the boy replied without hesitation. "The warm breath of living people." Elder Siku gathered the village council as the aurora borealis painted the sky in unnatural shades of green and purple. The lights danced with an intensity none of them had ever witnessed, forming patterns that seemed almost like writing across the heavens. The display was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, casting shifting shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources. "The signs are multiplying," the elder said, his voice heavy with the weight of ancient knowledge. "The drum that plays itself speaks of spiritual awakening. The animal's fear tells us that the natural order has been disturbed. The spoiled food warns us that her presence corrupts the very essence of life. Tulimak stood at the lodge's entrance, his hunter's instincts on high alert. What of the dreams? Half the village reports the same visions. This cannot be coincidence. Dreams are the spirit world's way of preparing us for what is to come, Ashiana replied. She is reaching out, testing our defenses, measuring our resolve. Each person who accepts her visions becomes more vulnerable to her influence. The shaman paused at the window, watching the impossible lights dance overhead. In the old stories, the aurora was said to be the spirits of the dead dancing across the sky. But these lights move with purpose, as if guided by a single will. As if summoned by their discussion, the drumming suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums like physical weight. Then, from the direction of the ceremonial lodge, came a new sound, humming in a voice that carried clearly across the frozen village, despite the walls that should have contained it. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a tune that seemed to capture the loneliness of the Arctic wind and the vast emptiness of the ice fields. But underneath its beauty lay something hungry, something that called to the warmth of living blood and the spark of human souls. One by one, villagers began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the irresistible song. They walked like sleepers, their faces blank and peaceful, moving steadily toward the lodge where the thawing woman waited. Ayana's weathered hands trembled as she unrolled the ancient Scrimshaw map. Its whalebone surface yellowed with age and etched with symbols that seemed to shift in the firelight. The map had been hidden in her grandmother's medicine bundle for 3 generations, never displayed because the knowledge it contained was deemed too dangerous for common viewing. Here, she said, pointing to a spiral carved near what appeared to be their current location. And here, and here. Each mark she indicated showed the same symbol, a woman's face surrounded by radiating lines that could have been either hair or ice crystals. Elder Siku leaned closer, his old eyes straining to make out the details. These markings span the entire Arctic coast. How many sites are there? 17 that I can identify, Ayana replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Each one accompanied by the same warning symbols. Each one marking a place where the Kalupalik have appeared. Nukka felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind, the ice spirits of legend. I thought they were stories to frighten children away from thin ice. All legends contain seeds of truth, the shaman replied. The Kalupalik are more than spirits. They are what remains when human souls become so consumed with vengeance that they refuse the natural cycle of death and rebirth. They bind themselves to the ice, drawing sustenance from the life force of others. She traced her finger along the carved coastline, showing how the symbols clustered around areas where multiple tribes had once lived. According to the map, they appear during times of great upheaval, when communities are divided, when people abandon the old ways in favor of easier paths. You speak as if our visitor is one of these creatures, Tulimak said. Though his hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt, Ayana nodded gravely. Her preservation in the ice, her unnatural beauty, the way she calls to our people in dreams, these are the classical signs. But more telling is this. She pointed to a section of the map covered in tiny marks that resembled tally scratches. These represent the number of souls each Kalupalik has claimed. Our woman's section has more marks than any other. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the woman's humming, which had not ceased since the previous night. Even now, they could see villagers gathering outside the ceremonial lodge, their faces blank with supernatural compulsion. If she is truly Kalupalik, why did she thank us for freeing her? Nukka asked. Would such a creature not simply take what it wanted? The binding to ice is both their strength and their weakness, Ayana explained. They can survive indefinitely in the frozen state, but they cannot act until they are warmed by living hands. We have given her exactly what she needed, not just physical warmth, but the willing participation of a community. Young Casquet, who had been silent throughout the discussion, suddenly spoke up. In my dreams, she shows me things. beautiful things. Cities beneath the ice, where no one ever grows old or hungry. She promises that those who serve her will live forever in comfort. And what does she ask in return for these promises? Elder Siku asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer, only that we help her become strong again. She says she has been sleeping for so long, and she needs our warmth to wake up fully. Casquet's eyes held a dreamy quality that alarmed the adults. She is lonely. She just wants companions who understand her. Ayana reached into her medicine bundle and withdrew a collection of carved bone amulets, each one depicting different protective spirits. These have been blessed by 7 generations of shamans. Wear them at all times and do not remove them even to sleep. As she distributed the amulets, the humming from the ceremonial lodge grew louder, more insistent. The aurora borealis began to dance overhead, despite the late morning hour, its green and purple lights visible even through the lodge's smoke hole. The map shows something else, Ayana said reluctantly. Each time a Kalupalik has been awakened, entire communities have vanished. Not killed, vanished, as if they walked into the ice willingly and never returned. Then why do you hesitate to destroy her while she is still weak? Tulimak demanded. Because, the shaman replied, studying the ancient markings more carefully, according to this, only one has ever been truly defeated, and the cost of that victory was everything the people held dear. The seal oil lamps began failing one by one, their flames guttering and dying despite being freshly filled with fuel. Each light that went out seemed to feed the growing darkness that emanated from the ceremonial lodge, as if the ice woman was drawing the very essence of warmth and illumination to herself. Grandmother Tapisa noticed it first when she tried to light the lamp in her dwelling for the evening meal. The wick caught fire normally, burned bright for several minutes, then suddenly dimmed to nothing, leaving behind only cold oil and the acrid smell of something that had never been meant to burn. It is as if she devours light itself, Tapisa whispered to her daughter-in-law, Siku's mother. The flame dies not from lack of fuel, but because something is stealing its essence. Throughout the village, similar reports accumulated. Lamps that had burned continuously for years suddenly refused to stay lit. Cooking fires required constant attention and fresh fuel to maintain even the smallest flame. The community's warmth, the very foundation of Arctic survival, was being systematically drained away. But it was the spread of illness that truly terrified the villagers. A strange malady had begun affecting those who spent too much time near the ceremonial lodge, not the familiar ailments of cold and hunger that they knew how to treat, but something that attacked the spirit as much as the body. The afflicted grew pale and listless, their eyes taking on a distant quality, as if they were seeing visions invisible to others. They spoke little, ate less, and showed an alarming tendency to wander toward the lodge during the night hours. When questioned about their behavior, they could provide no explanation beyond a vague sense that someone was calling them. Malik, the lead sled dog, had stopped eating entirely. The massive animal lay in his shelter, his thick coat providing no protection against a cold that seemed to come from within. His breathing was shallow and labored, and his eyes held the same distant look that plagued the human victims. The animals are more sensitive to spiritual disturbances, Ayana explained as she examined the dog. They feel the drain on the life force before we do. If we cannot stop this soon, every living thing in the village will be affected. The hunting had become impossible. The seals, caribou, and Arctic foxes that usually populated the area had fled, leaving behind an empty landscape that could not sustain human life. Even the fish in the breathing holes had disappeared, as if the water itself had become toxic to living creatures. Nukka returned from a fruitless hunting expedition, his sled empty and his dogs exhausted from pulling through snow that seemed heavier than natural ice. The land for miles around is barren, he reported to the gathered council. Not just empty, barren. As if life itself is afraid to venture close, Elder Siku nodded grimly. She is establishing her territory, claiming dominion over everything within her reach. The old stories speak of this, how the Kalupalik create zones of spiritual death around themselves, places where only they can thrive. Inside the ceremonial lodge, the Ice Woman's transformation continued. Her skin had taken on an otherworldly luminescence that was beautiful and terrifying. Her hair moved as if stirred by unfelt breezes, and her lips had begun to show the faintest hint of blue, not from cold, but from some internal change that defied explanation. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to move. Nothing dramatic, just the slight adjustment of a hand, the turning of her head, the flutter of eyelids that suggested consciousness returning to a mind that had been dormant for centuries. Each movement coincided with another lamp failing somewhere in the village. Young Casquet spent hours sitting beside her, immune to the cold that drove other visitors away within minutes. He spoke to her constantly, telling her about the village, about his family, about his hopes and fears. Those who overheard reported that he also asked her questions, then listened intently to responses that no one else could hear. "She is teaching him," Ayana said with growing alarm, "sharing knowledge that no human should possess. I can see the change in his aura, darkness creeping in where light used to shine. The aurora borealis had become a permanent fixture in the sky, no longer confined to the darkness of night, but visible at all hours as writhing curtains of green and purple light. The display was mesmerizing in its beauty, but it cast shadows that moved independently of any earthly object. As the third night approached, the villagers huddled in their increasingly cold dwellings, burning precious fuel in a desperate attempt to maintain warmth. Outside, the wind carried voices speaking in languages that predated human memory, and the ice beneath their feet groaned with sounds that resembled laughter. Casquet's carved soapstone seal, a toy he had treasured since childhood, sat transformed on his sleeping furs when his mother came to wake him for the morning meal. The familiar walrus ivory had turned to solid ice overnight, its surface so cold it burned to touch. But the young hunter himself was nowhere to be found. His mother, Panya, discovered the transformation when she reached to move the carving from where it lay beside Casquet's empty bed. The moment her fingers made contact, pain shot through her hand like lightning, and she saw her breath crystallize in the air around the frozen toy. The warmth seemed to drain from her entire body through that single point of contact. "Casquet!" she called out, her voice echoing through their dwelling with growing panic. "Casquet, where are you?" The search began immediately. Nukka organized teams to check every building in the village, while others examined the surrounding ice for tracks or signs of struggle. What they found was far worse than evidence of violence. They found Casquet himself, sitting upright beside his favorite fishing hole, his eyes open and staring at the aurora borealis that continued to dance overhead despite the morning light. He was frozen solid, not the familiar freezing death that claimed those who stayed too long in the Arctic cold, but something far more unnatural. His skin retained its color, his expression showed no sign of pain or fear, and his position suggested that he had simply chosen to sit and watch the lights until the cold claimed him. But the temperature required to freeze a healthy young man so completely should have taken hours. Casquet had been seen alive only 4 hours. Earlier, Elder Siku examined the body with hands that shook not from age but from recognition. "This is not natural death," he pronounced. "Look at his eyes. They still hold awareness. Look at his skin. No frostbite, no damage from cold. He has been preserved, just as she was preserved." Ayana knelt beside the frozen hunter, her shamanic senses recoiling from what she found. "His spirit is not here," she said quietly. "His body remains, but whatever made him Casquet has been taken elsewhere." The discovery sent waves of terror through the village. If Casquet, young and strong and full of life, could be claimed so easily, who among them was safe? Families huddled together in their dwellings, afraid to let their loved ones out of sight. But their fears proved justified when old Anana, the village's most respected seamstress, was found in a similar state that evening. She'd been discovered in her sewing corner, needle still in hand, working on a parka that would never be completed. Like Cascay, she showed no signs of struggle or suffering, only the peaceful expression of someone who had willingly surrendered to eternal cold. She touched the woman's clothing. Tulimak remembered with growing horror. When we first brought her to the lodge, Anana insisted on examining the stitching, said she wanted to understand the techniques used. Ayana nodded grimly. Direct contact creates a connection. The Kalupalik can follow that connection back to its source, drawing the life force through invisible threads that bind victim to predator. The pattern became clear as they examined both bodies more carefully. Each victim had somehow made contact with the ice woman, Cascay, through his long conversations beside her warming body, Anana through her examination of the mysterious clothing. The touch created a bridge that allowed the creature to drain away not just warmth, but the essential spark of life itself. We must assume that anyone who has been in the ceremonial lodge is at risk, Elder Siku declared. The question is not if she will claim more victims, but when and how quickly. As if summoned by their discussion, the haunting melody that had become the Ice Woman's signature rose again from the lodge, more beautiful and compelling than ever. Several villagers rose from their evening activities and began walking toward the sound, their faces blank with supernatural compulsion. This time, the adults were ready. They formed human chains to prevent their neighbors from reaching the lodge, physically restraining those who seemed lost to the creature's call. But the effort required constant vigilance, and they could see the strain in the eyes of those they held back, the desperate need to answer the summons warring with their rational fear. She grows stronger with each soul, she claims, Ayana observed as they fought to maintain their human barriers. Cascay and Anana were just the beginning. Soon her call will be too powerful for any of us to resist. In the distance, the aurora borealis painted the sky in shades of green that pulsed in rhythm with the Ice Woman's song. As if the very heavens were dancing to her will, the sacred fire bowl, forged from copper by Ayana's ancestors and blessed with the smoke of 100 purification ceremonies, refused to hold flame. No matter what fuel they offered it, the ancient vessel, which had never failed to burn even in the fiercest Arctic storms, now sat cold and lifeless, despite their desperate attempts to kindle the cleansing fires their traditions demanded. Even sweetgrass will not catch, Ayana said, her voice heavy with defeat as she tried for the 5th time to light the sacred herbs. The dried plants, gathered during the brief Arctic summer and blessed under the midnight sun, should have burst into fragrant flame. Instead, they crumbled to ash the moment spark touched them. Elder Siku watched the failed attempts with growing alarm. The spiritual realm rejects our offerings. She has created a zone where our ancestors' protections cannot reach us. The village had gathered in the main lodge for what might be their final attempt at traditional cleansing rituals. Every family contributed their most sacred items, amulets passed down through generations, tools blessed by long-dead shamans, ceremonial clothing worn only during the most important spiritual observances. Yet nothing seemed capable of functioning in the Ice Woman's presence. Nukka held his grandfather's pipe, carved from walrus ivory and inlaid with sacred stones. But the tobacco inside had turned to ice crystals, despite being stored in his warm dwelling. Even the smoke refuses to rise, he said, exhaling visible breath in air that should have been warmed by their gathered body heat. The drums, silent since the Ice Woman's own mysterious percussion had begun, lay lifeless no matter how skillfully they were struck. The sounds produced were muffled and flat, lacking the resonant voice that had called spirits to their ceremonies for countless generations. It was as if the very air had become too thick with supernatural presence to carry their prayers to the listening. Ancestors, young children who had shown shamanic gifts in the past, now cowered behind their parents. Their sensitive spirits overwhelmed by the darkness emanating from the ceremonial lodge. Little Nayeli, Nukka's daughter, pressed her hands to her ears and whispered, The Ice Lady's thoughts are too loud. I can't hear the good spirits anymore. She is not just blocking our rituals, Ayana realized with growing horror. She is consuming them. Every prayer we offer, every sacred flame we attempt to kindle, feeds her strength instead of invoking protection. The discussion turned to more desperate measures. Tulimak proposed using fire to destroy the ceremonial lodge entirely, burning the Ice Woman before she could fully awaken. Others suggested attempting to transport her body back to the ice, hoping that returning her to her frozen prison might weaken her hold over their community. But each proposal faced the same obstacle. None of them could approach the lodge without falling under her influence. The compulsion to serve her grew stronger with proximity, and those who ventured too close returned with the same distant expression that had marked Casque and Anana before their deaths. "What if we left?" suggested Maria, Casque's grieving mother. "Abandoned the village and traveled to our winter camps in the mountains. Would she follow us, or would distance break her power?" Elder Siku shook his head sadly. "The old stories tell us that the Kalupalik mark their chosen communities. No matter how far we travel, she would call us back. And in our absence, she would have time to fully establish her dominion over this place." As they debated increasingly desperate options, the Ice Woman's influence continued to spread. The aurora borealis now covered the entire sky, casting the village in an otherworldly green glow that made everything appear alien and threatening. The temperature had dropped so dramatically that even their warmest shelters provided little comfort. Most alarming of all, they could see her moving now through the lodge's windows. Not the slight adjustments they had observed before, but deliberate, purposeful motion. She was sitting up, turning her head to track sounds from outside, and her lips moved constantly, as if she were singing or speaking to invisible companions. "She is almost ready," Ayana said, watching the distant figure with dread. "When she can stand and walk freely, when she no longer needs the warmth of the lodge to sustain her, she will come for us all." The sacred fire bowl remained cold and empty, a symbol of their powerlessness against forces their ancestors had hoped would never again walk among the living. Outside, the wind carried voices speaking in harmonies that human throats could never produce, and shadows moved independently of the objects that should have cast them. The mirror of black ice materialized in Ayana's hands as she entered the ceremonial lodge, its obsidian surface reflecting not the thawed woman lying on the furs, but something far more terrifying. While the others saw only pale human beauty, the ancient scrying tool revealed the ice. Woman's true nature, a creature of shadows and frost with eyes, like empty winter sky, and fingers that ended in crystalline claws. The woman's eyes opened as Ayana approached, pupils dilating to impossible size before contracting to pinpoints of blue fire. When she spoke, her voice carried the sound of ice cracking under pressure and wind howling through empty spaces. "You see me as I truly am," the Ice Woman said, her words forming frost clouds in the air despite the lodge's warmth. "Your mirror shows what the heart knows, but the mind refuses to accept." Ayana held the obsidian surface steady, though her hands trembled with the effort. Through its reflection, she could see the creature's form shifting between human and something far more ancient, a being of living ice and accumulated malice that had worn human shape for so long it had almost forgotten its original nature. "What are you?" Ayana demanded, though she feared she already knew the answer. The Ice Woman sat up slowly, her movements producing the sound of breaking icicles. "I'm Siku," she said, using the Inuktitut word for ice. "I am the memory of every soul lost to the cold, every hunter who never returned home, every child who wandered too far onto thin ice. I am their final thoughts made manifest, their dying wishes given form." As she spoke, the temperature in the lodge plummeted. Breath became visible, and frost began forming on the walls, despite the fire that still burned in the center. The Ice Woman's true form became more apparent even without the mirror, skin that sparkled with internal ice crystals. hair that moved like drifting snow, and a presence that seemed to draw warmth from everything around her. "You were human once," Ayana said, recognizing the terrible sadness that lay beneath the creature's predatory nature. "I was Anna," the being replied, and for a moment her voice carried the echo of mortal pain. "I was the shaman of a village much like yours, 300 winters ago. My people faced starvation when the caribou migrations changed and the seals grew scarce. In my desperation to save them, I made a bargain with the spirits of the deep ice." The obsidian mirror showed flashes of memory, a woman dancing around a fire built on a frozen lake, calling to powers that should never have been disturbed, offering her own life force in exchange for her people's survival. "The spirits granted my request," Anna continued, her beautiful human mask slipping further to reveal the crystalline horror beneath. "The hunting improved, food became abundant, and my village prospered. But the price was my humanity. With each passing season, I became more ice than flesh, more spirit than woman." Siana watched in fascination and horror as the creature's transformation accelerated. "What happened to your people?" "They served me willingly at first, grateful for the prosperity I had brought. But as I changed, so did my needs. I required not just offerings of food and fire, but the warmth of living souls. One by one, I drained them, telling myself it was necessary for their continued survival." The lodge filled with the sound of wind through broken ice, as Anna's true nature asserted itself fully. Her skin became translucent, revealing a network of frozen veins beneath. Her eyes lost all human warmth, becoming windows into endless winter. In the end, I stood alone in a village of frozen statues, my people preserved in ice, their souls bound to serve me for eternity. But preservation is not life, and service without choice is merely slavery. I had saved them from starvation, only to trap them in something far worse. "Then you know the horror of what you do," Ayana said, struggling to maintain her grip on the mirror as supernatural cold numbed her fingers. "You understand the price of your existence." Anna's laugh was the sound of glaciers carving into the sea. "Understanding does not grant the power to change. I'm bound by the bargain I made, compelled to repeat the pattern wherever I wake. Your village will prosper under my protection, just as mine did. Your people will serve me willingly, just as mine did. And in the end, you will all join my eternal winter." The obsidian mirror cracked down its center, unable to contain the reflection of such concentrated malevolence. Through the fractured surface, Ayana saw not just Anna's current form, but glimpses of all the villages she had claimed over 3 centuries, countless communities reduced to frozen tableau of perfect, lifeless preservation. The bone chronicle lay hidden beneath Elder Siku's sleeping furs, a mammoth tusk carved with the accumulated wisdom of 20 generations. As Ayana fled the ceremonial lodge with news of Anna's terrible revelation, the elder unwrapped the ancient artifact with trembling hands, knowing that somewhere in its spiral of carved symbols lay the key to understanding their enemy. The tusk was massive, nearly as long as a man's arm and covered from base to tip with intricate carvings that told the oral history of their people. Most of the symbols were familiar: hunting scenes, seasonal celebrations, the births and deaths of great leaders. But as Siku's fingers traced the oldest sections, he found the markings he had hoped never to need. "Here," he said, calling Ayana and Nukka to examine the carvings. "The story of the cursed shaman passed down from the time when our ancestors first settled these lands." The carved images showed a village by a great lake, its people celebrating abundant hunts and full food stores. At the center of the celebrations stood a woman with arms raised to the sky, surrounded by symbols that represented spiritual power and divine favor. But as the story progressed along the tusk's curved surface, the images grew darker. "She began as a protector," Siku translated, his weathered fingers following the carved narrative. "When the great hunger came, when the animals fled and the ice grew too thick for fishing, she sought aid from the ancient spirits. But not the gentle ancestors who guide shamans to wisdom. She called upon the powers that sleep beneath the deepest ice. The carvings showed the woman dancing around a fire, built on what appeared to be a frozen lake. Her arms extended towards shapes that emerged from cracks in the ice. The beings that answered her call were depicted with flowing forms and eyes like empty sockets, creatures of pure cold and endless appetite. The deep ice spirits granted her request, Siku continued, but their aid came with conditions that transformed the bargain into a curse. With each soul she claimed to feed their hunger, she became more like them, less human, more spirit, until she could no longer distinguish between protection and predation. Nukka studied the carvings that showed the village's final fate. Her people appear to be sleeping, not dead. They look peaceful. That is the cruelest part of her gift, Ayana said, understanding dawning in her voice. She preserves them in a state between life and death, conscious enough to serve her, but powerless to resist or escape. They experience an eternity of servitude while believing they are safe and cared for. The Bone Chronicle showed additional details that chilled them all. Images of the cursed shaman traveling from village to village, leaving behind communities of frozen servants who appeared to go about their daily activities, but whose souls belonged entirely to her. Each settlement looked prosperous and well-fed, but the carved faces of the inhabitants held no spark of true life. How many communities has she claimed? Nukka asked. Though he dreaded the answer, Elder Siku counted the village symbols that appeared throughout the chronicle's later sections. 17 that are recorded here, but this tusk only covers the 1st century after her transformation. There could be many more. The chronicle revealed another disturbing truth. Achna's pattern of hibernation and awakening followed natural cycles, appearing roughly every 30 to 40 years as the Arctic ice shifted and changed. She would establish herself in a community, drain it of life over several seasons, then return to frozen sleep until geological forces or human interference disturbed her rest. She told Ayana that understanding does not grant the power to change, Siku said, studying the final carvings on the tusk. But that may not be entirely true. These symbols suggest that the original curse can be broken, though the cost is enormous. The eldest carvings showed a different outcome. A village where the cursed shaman was confronted not with weapons or traditional spiritual defenses, but with something far more powerful. The images were worn and difficult to interpret, but they appeared to show the shaman weeping, her icy exterior cracking like a breaking glacier. Compassion, Ayana breathed, understanding the meaning of the faded symbols. Someone showed her compassion instead of fear, reminded her of her original humanity instead of fighting her transformed nature. But the final image on the Bone Chronicle was sobering. The person who had offered that compassion lay frozen beside the departing shaman, their sacrifice enabling her release but costing them their own life. The message was clear. Breaking Achna's curse was possible, but it required someone willing to pay the ultimate price. Outside, the wind carried the sound of Anna's song growing stronger, and through the lodge's windows they could see villagers beginning to gather around the ceremonial lodge despite the late hour, their faces blank with supernatural compulsion. The bloodstone pendant hanging around Nukka's neck began to glow with inner fire as Anna emerged from the ceremonial lodge, her transformed presence casting shadows that moved independently of any earthly light source. The red jasper amulet, blessed by his grandfather's grandfather and passed down through 5 generations, had never shown such radiance, its crimson depths pulsing, with warmth that seemed to recognize the spiritual significance of the moment. Anna walked among the gathered villagers like a queen surveying her subjects, her crystalline beauty terrible to behold. Those who had answered her call stood motionless around her, their faces serene but empty of true consciousness. They included friends, neighbors, family members, people who had lived full lives just days before, but now served as extensions of her supernatural will. "Choose," Anna said, her voice carrying clearly across the frozen village, despite being barely above a whisper. "Offer me one soul freely given, and I will depart your lands without claiming another. Refuse, and before the next full moon, every living being in Kaktovik will join my eternal winter." The bloodstone pendant grew warmer against Nukka's chest as he stepped forward, understanding with crystalline clarity what was being asked of him. The artifact had been crafted specifically for moments like this, times when someone must willingly sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Its glow indicated his readiness to make that ultimate choice. "I volunteer myself," Nukka said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. "Take my life and spare my people." Anna studied him with eyes that held the depth of Arctic winter. "You would die for strangers? For people who have shown you no particular loyalty or gratitude?" "They are not strangers," Nukka replied, thinking of Elena teaching her grandson to plant seeds, of Sarah learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when vegetables were ready for harvest, of Jim sharing stories with the children while they helped tend the common areas. "They are my community, my family, the future I want to protect." The ice woman circled him slowly, her footsteps leaving frost patterns on the ground. "And what of your own future? Your own dreams and desires? You would surrender all of that for people who may not even remember your sacrifice." Nukka felt the bloodstone pendant pulse with increasing warmth, as if drawing strength from his certainty. Some things matter more than individual survival. The connections we build, the knowledge we pass on, the love we share, these things continue even when we do not. "Pretty words," Anna said, though something in her voice suggested she was not entirely unmoved by them. "But you do not understand what you are offering. I do not simply take life, I claim souls. You would serve me for eternity, conscious but powerless, watching as I use your village as a hunting ground for centuries to come." Elder Siku stepped forward, his ancient eyes bright with understanding. "That is not what the Bone Chronicle shows. The original curse requires willing sacrifice, but true willingness breaks the pattern instead of feeding it." Anna turned to face the elder, her beautiful mask slipping to reveal the crystalline horror beneath. "Old man, you speak of things beyond your understanding." "I speak of what my ancestors recorded," Siku replied calmly. "A curse born of desperation can only be ended by its opposite, someone choosing sacrifice not from desperation, but from love." The bloodstone pendant's glow intensified, its light visible even in the aurora's supernatural radiance. Nukka could feel its warmth spreading through his body, strengthening his resolve and clarifying his purpose. The artifact was not just marking his willingness to die, it was preparing him for something far more significant. "If I offer myself freely, without coercion or fear," Nukka said, "if my choice comes from love rather than desperation, what happens to your curse?" For the first time since her awakening, Anna appeared uncertain. "You cannot know that. No one has ever made such an offer. Then let us discover together what happens when someone chooses compassion over fear, love over preservation." Nukka extended his hand toward her, the bloodstone pendant blazing like a star against his chest. "I offer myself not to feed your hunger, but to heal your pain." The ice woman stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a venomous snake. Around them the village held its breath, and even the aurora borealis seemed to pause in its endless dance across the sky. The sacrifice blade materialized in Ahna's hands, as if drawn from the depths of winter itself, an obsidian knife so ancient that its edges seemed to cut reality rather than merely physical matter. The weapon's surface reflected not light but shadow, and touching it would drain the life from anyone except those already marked by supernatural forces. "If you truly wish to break rather than feed the curse," Anna said, holding the blade between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, "then you must understand the ritual's true requirements. This is no simple death. It is a spiritual transformation that will reshape both our souls." Nukka studied the weapon with a hunter's eye for detail. The obsidian had been shaped by inhuman hands, its surface covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The handle was carved from what appeared to be ice that never melted, wrapped in leather that might once have been human skin. Most disturbing of all, He could see faces trapped within the blade's dark surface, the souls of all who had been claimed by its edge over the centuries. The ritual must be performed at the heart of the spiritual storm, Anna continued, gesturing toward the aurora borealis that now covered the entire sky in writhing curtains of green and purple light. Where the boundaries between worlds grow thin, where mortal choices can reshape immortal curses. Elder Siku studied the blade with the accumulated wisdom of his years. This weapon was forged by the deep ice spirits themselves. It carries the power to sever not just life from body, but soul from the cycle of existence. Anyone cut by its edge faces true death. No afterlife, no rebirth, simply an ending. That is why the ritual has never been completed, Anna said, her voice carrying centuries of isolation and despair. Who would willingly accept such absolute termination? Even the most selfless souls retreat when faced with total obliteration. But Nukka felt the bloodstone pendant pulse with warmth against his chest, its crimson light seeming to offer protection against the blade's terrible hunger. If my ending brings life to others, then it is not obliteration, it is transformation. My soul becomes part of something larger than individual existence. Ayana approached slowly, her shamanic senses recoiling from the weapon's spiritual presence. The blade shows me visions of all who have died by its edge. They do not rest peacefully. They are trapped within the obsidian, conscious but powerless, experiencing eternal torment. Another reason the ritual has never been completed, Anna said. Even the most willing sacrifice balks when they understand the true cost. But without that complete surrender, the curse remains unbroken. The villagers gathered in a circle around them, drawn by the supernatural forces at work, but unable to approach too closely. The blade's presence created a zone of absolute cold, where breath turned to ice crystals, and exposed skin burned with frost. Only those protected by powerful spiritual artifacts could remain within its influence. What happens to you if the ritual succeeds? Nukka asked, surprising everyone with his concern for his enemy's fate. Anna's beautiful mask slipped again, revealing the crystalline horror beneath, but also something more vulnerable, the remnants of the woman she had once been. I do not know. Perhaps I find the death that was denied me 3 centuries ago. Perhaps I face judgment for all the souls I have claimed. Perhaps I simply cease to exist, which would be mercy after so long as this creature. And if the ritual fails, then you join the faces in the blade, and I continue my existence as before, eventually claiming every soul in your village. The pattern repeats until someone with greater courage or wisdom finds another way to break what I have become. Nukka reached toward the blade, then hesitated as the bloodstone pendant grew almost too hot to bear. The artifact was warning him about something, not the danger of the weapon itself, but some crucial element of the ritual that he had not yet understood. Show me the exact requirements, he said. If I am to do this, I must know every step, every condition that must be met. Anna's expression grew almost grateful as she began to explain the ancient ritual's demands. The sacrifice had to be performed during the peak of spiritual activity, when the aurora touched the earth itself. The victim must hold the blade willingly, driving it into their own heart to prove the absolute freedom of their choice. And most crucial of all, the one who offered the sacrifice must feel genuine compassion for the cursed being they sought to free. As she spoke, frost began forming around their feet, and the aurora borealis descended from the heavens to dance among them like living light. The circle of standing stones emerged from beneath centuries of accumulated snow and ice as Anna's power reached its crescendo, ancient monoliths rising like teeth from the earth to form a perfect ring around the ceremonial space. Each stone bore carved symbols that glowed with the same ethereal light as the aurora borealis, creating a boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits. Nukka stood at the circle's center, the obsidian blade heavy in his hands as supernatural forces gathered around them. The aurora had descended from the sky to dance between the stones, its green and purple flames casting shadows that belonged to no earthly geometry. The very air seemed to vibrate with power, making breathing difficult and thought crystalline clear. "The stones mark where my original bargain was struck," Anna said, her form shifting between human beauty and crystalline horror as the ritual space activated. 300 years ago, I danced here in desperation, calling to powers that should have remained undisturbed. Tonight, in this same place, we will discover whether love can undo what desperation created. Elder Siku stood at the circle's edge, his voice raised in the old chants that had once protected their people from spiritual dangers. But the words seemed to change as he spoke them, twisted by the supernatural forces at work until they became something entirely different. Not protection spells, but invocations that called the deep ice spirits to witness what was about to unfold. The villagers formed an outer ring beyond the stones, their faces reflecting the aurora's dancing light. They watched in silence as their friend and neighbor prepared to sacrifice himself for their survival, understanding that they were witnessing something that would echo through generations of their oral history. Ayana held her remaining shamanic artifacts, eagle feathers and carved bone amulets, that glowed with their own inner light. But even these powerful totems seemed small and inadequate against the forces that Anna commanded. "The spiritual pressure is enormous," she called to Nukka. "The boundary between worlds has almost dissolved completely." Inside the stone circle, reality operated by different rules. Time moved in spirals rather than straight lines, allowing Nukka to see glimpses of the past and possible futures. He witnessed Anna's original transformation, a desperate woman calling to ancient powers as her village starved around her. He saw the moment when the deep ice spirits answered her plea, offering salvation that came wrapped in eternal damnation. But he also saw other possibilities, paths where compassion triumphed over fear, where understanding replaced vengeance, where the cycle of supernatural predation could finally be broken. The bloodstone pendant against his chest showed him these visions, its warmth the only constant in a reality that shifted like aurora-lit clouds. "I understand now," Nukka said, his voice carrying clearly despite the spiritual storm raging around them. "You never wanted to become this creature. You were trying to save your people, just as I am trying to save mine." Anna's beautiful mask cracked like breaking ice, revealing not the crystalline horror beneath, but something far more heartbreaking, the face of a woman who had carried 3 centuries of guilt and self-hatred. "Every soul I claimed, I told myself it was necessary. Every village I drained, I convinced myself they were better off in my eternal winter than facing the struggles of mortal existence." The obsidian blade grew heavier in Nukka's hands, its surface reflecting not his face, but the faces of all who had died by its edge. Their expressions showed not torment, but a strange peace, as if they had found something beyond individual suffering in their sacrifice. The deep ice spirits feed on desperation and fear, Nukka realized, understanding flooding through him like spring warmth. But they cannot comprehend love freely given without expectation of reward. That is why this ritual can break your curse. It offers them something they cannot consume or corrupt. The aurora flames reach down to touch the standing stones, causing the ancient symbols to blaze with light that made the midnight tundra bright as day. The spiritual storm was reaching its peak, the moment when the barriers between worlds would be thinnest. Anna stood before him, no longer wearing her beautiful mask, but appearing as she truly was, a woman trapped between life and death, human in spirit, salvation and damnation. Her crystalline form was shot through with veins of golden light that pulsed in rhythm with Nukka's bloodstone pendant. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice carrying all the weight of 3 centuries of isolation. "There will be no returning from this choice." Nukka raised the obsidian blade, feeling its terrible weight and sensing the souls trapped within its dark surface. Around them, the stone circle hummed with power, and the aurora borealis painted the sky in colors that had no earthly names, Nukka's family totem blazed to life. In his hand, as he raised the obsidian blade, a polar bear carved from ancient walrus ivory that had passed through 7 generations of his bloodline. The carved figure's eyes suddenly glowed with spiritual fire, and its mouth opened to release the roar of the great bear spirit that had guided his ancestors for centuries. The moment the totem activated, Agnes stumbled backward as if struck by a physical blow. Her crystalline features twisted with recognition and something that might have been fear. "No," she whispered, her voice carrying the sound of breaking ice. "It cannot be. The bloodline was ended. I made certain of it." Elder Siku stepped closer to the stone circle's edge, his ancient eyes wide with understanding. "Nukka carries the blood of Siku the Wise, the shaman who first bound your curse 3 centuries ago. The same spiritual power that created your prison runs in his veins." The polar bear totem grew warm in Nukka's hand, and suddenly he could see beyond the physical realm into the world of spirits and ancient powers. The aurora borealis revealed itself as more than mere light. It was a manifestation of the eternal struggle between the deep ice spirits and the protective ancestors who watched over the living. "Your ancestor," Anna said, her voice filled with centuries of accumulated rage, "was the one who showed me compassion when my village starved. He offered to help me call upon the ancient powers, promised that together we could save both our communities from the great hunger." The vision unfolded before Nukka's spirit-enhanced sight, like pages turning in an invisible book. He saw his ancestor, a young shaman named Siku, working alongside Anna to perform the ritual that was meant to ensure abundant hunting for their combined peoples. But something had gone wrong in the ceremony. The deep ice spirits had demanded a price that neither shaman had anticipated. Siku tried to share the burden, Nukka realized, understanding flooding through him. He attempted to split the curse between both of you so that neither would bear its full weight alone. He succeeded only in binding our spirits together across time, Anna replied. Her beautiful mask completely dissolved now to reveal the ancient pain beneath. Every moment of my existence, I have felt his presence, his guilt, his attempts to find a way to undo what we had done. His spirit has been my constant companion in this eternal winter. The polar bear totem showed Nukka more of the truth, how his ancestor had spent his remaining years searching for a way to break the curse, how he had carved the bone chronicle that Elder Siku now possessed, how he had blessed Nukka's bloodline with the spiritual strength that would one day be needed to face this moment. "The blood connection changes everything," Ayana called from beyond the stone circle, her shamanic senses reading the shift in supernatural forces. "You are not just offering yourself as sacrifice, you are completing a ritual that was begun 3 centuries ago." The obsidian blade grew, lighter in Nukka's hands as the polar bear totem's power flowed through him. The weapon's hunger for souls was being countered by the protective spirit of his ancestral guardian, creating a balance that had never existed before in the ritual's long history. "If I strike with this blade while channeling my ancestor's spirit," Nukka said, understanding the true nature of what was required, "I can break your curse without feeding it. The deep ice spirits will lose their hold over you because the original bargain will finally be fulfilled as it was meant to be." Anna's crystalline form began to crack like ice under spring pressure, revealing glimpses of the woman she had once been. "But the cost, you will still die. The blade still claims its price." "Death is not the worst fate," Nukka replied, feeling his ancestors' wisdom flowing through him via the polar bear totem. "Siku has been trapped in the spiritual realm for 3 centuries, unable to rest because of his failure to complete what he started. My sacrifice will free both of you from the bonds that have held you prisoner." The aurora borealis suddenly intensified, its green and purple flames reaching down to touch the standing stones and creating a pillar of light that connected earth to sky. The spiritual pressure became almost unbearable as 3 centuries of accumulated power prepared to release in a single transformative moment. In the distance, the deep ice spirits could be felt approaching, ancient beings of pure cold and hunger drawn by the scent of the ritual's culmination. But for the first time in 300 years, Anna did not welcome their presence. Instead, she turned to face them with defiance, her hand reaching toward Nukka in a gesture of alliance. Rather than predation, the shamanic spirit mask materialized over Nukka's face as the deep ice spirits emerged from the aurora's dancing flames, ancient beings of crystalline horror whose very presence turned the air to frozen mist. The mask, carved from driftwood, blessed by countless generations of shamans, allowed him to perceive and interact with the supernatural entities on their own plane of existence. Through the mask's carved eye holes, Nukka could see the deep ice spirits in their true form, towering figures of living glacier and accumulated malice. Being so ancient, they predated human civilization. Their voices were the sound of ice sheets cracking, their eyes were empty spaces where light went to die, and their presence drained warmth from reality itself. "The bargain stands," the largest spirit intoned, its words forming frost crystals in the air. "The shaman woman serves our purpose. Her hunger feeds our realm. You cannot break what has been sealed with souls." But Anna stepped forward, her crystalline form blazing with newfound purpose as she faced her ancient masters. "The bargain was made under false terms. You promised to save my people, but you turned me into their destroyer. You offered power, but delivered only endless torment." The spirit mask showed Nukka the true nature of the battle they faced, not a physical confrontation, but a war fought across multiple planes of existence simultaneously. On the earthly plane, they stood within the stone circle surrounded by aurora light. On the spiritual plane, they faced beings whose power could reshape reality itself. "I invoke the right of completion," Nukka declared, drawing upon ancestral knowledge that flowed through the spirit mask. 3 centuries ago, Siku the Wise began a ritual to balance your bargain with justice. That working was never finished, until now. The polar bear totem in his hand roared with spiritual force, its carved form becoming a conduit for his ancestors' will. Through the connection, Nukka felt Siku's presence joining him in the spirit realm, a tired soul that had waited 300 years for this moment of redemption. The deep ice spirits recoiled from the combined power of living shaman and ancestral spirit. "The Old One is bound to our realm. He cannot interfere with mortal affairs." "He is not interfering," Nukka replied, understanding flooding through him as the spirit mask revealed the true nature of shamanic power. "He is completing what he began. I am the living anchor for his unfinished work, the bloodline connection that allows past and present to unite." The battle erupted across multiple dimensions simultaneously. On the physical plane, wind howled through the stone circle with hurricane force, and ice formed so rapidly it created spears that thrust up from the ground. The aurora borealis writhed like living serpents of light, painting the sky in colors that human eyes were never meant to perceive. But it was on the spiritual plane that the true combat took place. Nukka found himself fighting alongside his ancestors' spirit, their combined will focused through the shamanic mask and polar bear totem. Together, they faced the deep ice spirit's attempts to maintain their hold over Achna's soul. The obsidian blade in Nukka's hand became a weapon of spiritual fire rather than physical death. Each strike he made with it severed one of the invisible chains that bound Anna to her cursed existence. But the deep ice spirits fought back, sending waves of supernatural cold that threatened to freeze his soul within his living body. "The girl shaman grows weak," the largest spirit observed, turning its attention to Anna. "She wavers between servitude and rebellion. Perhaps we should claim her completely, transform her into something that cannot question our will." But Anna had found her own source of power in the choice to resist. "I was human once," she declared, her crystalline form blazing with inner light. I had a name, a people, dreams of my own. You stole those from me, but you could never destroy them completely. The spirit mask showed Nukka the moment of victory, not when the deep ice spirits were defeated, but when Anna finally remembered who she had been before the curse transformed her. The ancient entities fed on despair and spiritual emptiness, but they could not consume a soul that had rediscovered its own worth. Now, Siku's spirit whispered through the polar bear totem, while she remembers her humanity. Strike now, and the curse will shatter like ice under spring sunshine. Nukka raised the obsidian blade, feeling 3 centuries of accumulated power flowing through him as the ritual reached its climax. The heart of winter materialized in the space between Nukka and ignited as the obsidian blade descended, a crystalline formation that pulsed with the rhythm of a frozen heart, containing within its faceted depths the essence of Anna's trapped soul. The artifact was beautiful and terrible, like a diamond made of compressed anguish and centuries of accumulated sorrow. "There," Anna whispered, her voice filled with wonder and fear as she saw her own spiritual essence made manifest. "That is what remains of who I was before the curse. The deep ice spirits encased my humanity in eternal winter, but they could not destroy it completely. The heart of winter hung suspended in the aurora's dancing light, neither falling nor rising, but existing in the space between realities, where spiritual transformation became possible. Its surface reflected not the present moment, but memories of who Ahna had been, a young woman learning the shamanic arts, a protector of her people, a soul filled with hope rather than hunger. Through the spirit mask, Nukka could see the crystalline heart's true significance. It was not just a repository of Ahna's humanity, it was the key to breaking the curse that had bound her to the deep ice spirits. But the crystal was surrounded by layers of supernatural ice that had accumulated over 3 centuries, each layer representing another soul she had claimed, another community she had drained. I must shatter it, Nukka realized, understanding flooding through him via his ancestors' spiritual guidance. But not to destroy what lies within, to free it from its prison of accumulated guilt and pain. The deep ice spirits roared their displeasure as they sensed the shift in the ritual's focus. "The heart is ours by right of conquest. We claimed it when she first called upon our power. You cannot reclaim what was freely given." But Anna stepped forward, her crystalline form blazing with newfound determination. "It was not freely given, it was stolen through deception. You promised salvation and delivered damnation. You offered power and provided only enslavement." The heart of winter pulsed brighter as Anna approached it, responding to the proximity of its original owner. But the ice surrounding it grew thicker, as if the deep ice spirits were attempting to seal away her humanity permanently, rather than risk losing their hold over her. Nukka raised the obsidian blade, but instead of striking at Anna or himself, he directed its power toward the crystalline heart. The weapon, designed to claim souls, instead became a tool of liberation as it touched the accumulated ice surrounding Anna's trapped essence. Each strike sent cracks spreading through the supernatural ice, revealing glimpses of the warmth and light trapped within. But the deep ice spirits fought back, sending waves of killing cold that threatened to freeze Nukka's soul before he could complete the work. "I remember," Anna said suddenly, her voice filled with 3 centuries of suppressed memory. "I remember my name, not the title the spirits gave me, but the name my mother spoke when I was born. I remember the songs my grandmother taught me, the herbs I gathered to heal the sick, the children who called me teacher." With each recovered memory, another layer of ice cracked and fell away from the heart of winter. The deep ice spirit's hold over her was weakening as she reclaimed the human identity they had tried to erase. The polar bear totem in Nukka's free hand roared with ancestral power, channeling the strength of 7 generations of shamans into the blade's strikes. Each blow was guided not by his own skill, but by the accumulated wisdom of his bloodline. precision born of spiritual knowledge that transcended individual ability. The final layer, Siku's spirit whispered through the totem. Strike true, and her soul returns to her keeping. Miss, and the deep ice spirits claim victory for another 3 centuries. The heart of winter pulsed with increasing intensity as Nukka prepared the final blow. Within its crystal depths, he could see not just Ahana's humanity, but the souls of all those she had claimed over the centuries. Villagers who had been trapped in her eternal winter. Forced to serve her supernatural hunger, they will be freed as well, Anna said, understanding what Nukka saw within the crystal. Every soul I claimed, every life I stole, they have been waiting for this moment as much as I have. The obsidian blade blazed with spiritual fire as Nukka brought it down upon the heart of winter's final protective shell. The moment of impact sent shockwaves across multiple planes of existence, and the aurora borealis exploded into light so bright it turned the Arctic night to day. The crystal shattered like a star being born, releasing 3 centuries of trapped souls in a cascade of golden light that rose toward the heavens like a river flowing. Upward, healing waters bubbled up from the previously frozen ground where the heart of winter had shattered, creating a sacred spring that steamed in the Arctic air despite the sub-zero temperatures. The water glowed with the same golden light that had carried the freed souls skyward, and where it touched the earth, life began returning to the barren landscape around Kaktovik. Ahna knelt beside the spring, her crystalline form dissolving like ice in summer warmth as her true humanity was restored. With each passing moment, she appeared more human and less spirit, her skin regaining natural color, her hair losing its supernatural movement, her eyes reflecting mortality instead of endless winter. I feel them departing, she said, her voice now carrying the warmth of a living woman rather than the cold of eternal winter. All the souls I claimed over the centuries, they are finally free to continue their journeys to whatever comes after life. The spring water touched Nukka's feet, and he felt warmth spreading through his body despite the continuing cold. The healing waters carried more than physical comfort. They brought spiritual renewal, washing away the supernatural exhaustion that had accumulated during the battle with the deep ice spirits. Around the village, miraculous changes began manifesting. The seal oil lamps that had refused to burn suddenly blazed to life with warm, steady flames. The food stores that had spoiled overnight returned to their preserved state, and the hunting dogs that had cowered in fear now emerged from their shelters with tails wagging and eyes bright with renewed vitality. Young Cascais and older Nana, who had been frozen by Anna's supernatural hunger, began to stir as life returned to their preserved forms. The ice that had claimed them melted away like morning frost, and they drew their first breaths in days, with wonder and confusion but no apparent harm from their ordeal. How is this possible? Elder Siku asked, watching as his village returned to life around him. I have seen death many times, but never have I witnessed its reversal. Anna rose from beside the spring, her transformation complete. She appeared now as she might have looked in life, a woman of perhaps 30 years, with kind eyes and hands marked by the practical work of shamanic healing. The souls I claimed were not truly dead, she explained. They were suspended between life and death, their essence trapped in my eternal winter. Breaking the curse freed them to choose their own fates. The aurora borealis had returned to its natural patterns, no longer the supernatural storm that had threatened to tear reality apart. The green and purple lights danced normally across the star-filled sky, beautiful but no longer terrifying in their intensity. Ayana emerged from her dwelling, carrying her shamanic tools, amazed to find that they functioned normally once again. The sacred fire bowl accepted flame readily, the drums produced their proper resonant voice, and her protective amulets glowed with gentle power instead of shattering under supernatural pressure. The deep ice spirits have withdrawn, she announced after casting the traditional divination patterns. They no longer have any claim on this place or its people. The spiritual balance has been restored, but it was the change in the land itself that provided the most hope. Where the healing waters touched the earth, signs of life appeared. Not the full growth of summer, but the promise of renewal that would come with spring. Seeds that had lain dormant beneath the ice began to sprout, and tracks in the snow indicated that the animals had begun returning to an area they had fled in supernatural terror. Nukka felt the polar bear, totem in his hand, grow warm one final time as his ancestor's spirit prepared to depart. Through the connection, he sensed Siku the Wise's profound relief at finally completing the work he had begun 3 centuries ago. "Thank you," the ancient shaman's voice whispered through the totem. "The burden I have carried all these years is finally lifted. I can rest now, knowing that compassion proved stronger than vengeance, that love could heal what desperation had broken." The totem's warmth faded as Siku's spirit departed for whatever realm awaited him. His long vigil finally ended. But the polar bear carving retained a gentle glow. Blessed now, with the accumulated wisdom of 7 generations and the power to protect Nukka's descendants from similar spiritual threats, Anna approached Nukka as the immediate celebration of their survival began around them. "You offered me something I had forgotten existed," she said quietly. "Forgiveness for unforgivable acts, compassion for someone who had shown none to others. How do I repay such a gift?" "Help us rebuild what was damaged," Nukka replied simply. "Share the knowledge you have gained over 3 centuries. Teach us how to recognize and resist the kinds of spiritual dangers that created your curse in the first place." Nukka's new hunting spear gleamed with otherworldly beauty as he prepared for the spring hunt. Its shaft carved from driftwood that had been blessed by Anna before her departure, and its point forged from metal that had never known earthly fire. The weapon hummed with protective power, ensuring that those who carried it would find success in their endeavors and safety from supernatural threats that might still lurk in the vast Arctic wilderness. 6 months had passed since the night of transformation, and Kaktovik had not only recovered from its ordeal, but had grown stronger in ways that transcended mere survival. The healing spring continued to flow despite the return of winter's deepest cold, providing a source of spiritual renewal that drew visitors from neighboring communities who had heard the remarkable story of compassion conquering ancient evil. Elder Siku, rejuvenated by the spiritual cleansing that had accompanied Anna's redemption, had become the keeper of expanded oral traditions that now included detailed accounts of how to recognize and resist supernatural predators. Children gathered around him each evening to hear not just the old stories, but new tales of courage, sacrifice, and the power of choosing love over fear, even in the darkest circumstances. "The spear will guide your hunt," Agna had said during the blessing ceremony before her departure to seek other communities that might need her help in healing spiritual wounds. But more importantly, it will remind you that strength comes not from domination, but from protection. Not from taking, but from giving. Young Cascade, fully recovered from his supernatural freezing, but forever changed by the experience, had taken up the role of teaching hunting skills to children while emphasizing the spiritual responsibilities that came with taking life to sustain life. His toy seal, transformed back from ice to carved stone, had become a sacred object that helped him explain the interconnectedness of all living things. "When we hunt," he would tell his young students, "we ask permission from the spirits of the animals. When we take life, we give thanks for the sacrifice. When we use what we have taken, we waste nothing and share everything. This is how we honor the balance that keeps our world healthy." The village's success in the spring hunt exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. Seals returned to the breathing holes in numbers not seen for years. Caribou migrations resumed their traditional patterns, and even the fishing improved as natural cycles reasserted themselves in the absence of supernatural interference. But it was the spiritual changes that proved most significant. The community had learned to face impossible challenges through unity rather than individual heroism, to seek understanding rather than immediate judgment, and to offer compassion even to those who seemed beyond redemption. Ayana had established a new shamanic tradition that incorporated the lessons learned from their encounter with the ancient curse. Young people with spiritual gifts were trained not just in the traditional arts of healing and divination, but in recognizing the signs of supernatural corruption and the techniques needed to cleanse communities of spiritual poison. Power without wisdom becomes tyranny, she taught her apprentices. Wisdom without compassion becomes cold judgment, but compassion without courage becomes mere sentiment. A true shaman must balance all three qualities to serve their people effectively. The aurora borealis danced overhead as Nukka returned from his hunt, the blessed spear having guided him to a successful encounter with a magnificent bull caribou that would feed several families through the remaining winter months. The lights in the sky seem more beautiful now than they had before the crisis, their natural patterns untainted by supernatural malevolence. As he approached the village, Nukka could see the warm glow of oil lamps in every dwelling, hear the laughter of children playing games in the snow, and smell the comforting smoke of cooking fires that burned steadily without supernatural interference. These simple pleasures, once taken for granted, now felt like daily miracles that reminded him of how precious ordinary life truly was. The healing spring steamed gently in the center of the village, its waters still carrying traces of the golden light that had freed so many trapped souls. Families came there not just for physical healing, but for spiritual renewal, understanding that the spring represented hope, triumphant over despair, love victorious over hatred. In the growing darkness of Arctic winter, Nukka felt no fear of what might emerge from the ice or descend from the aurora-painted sky. His community had faced the ultimate supernatural threat and discovered that their greatest strength lay not in weapons or shamanic magic, but in their willingness to choose compassion over vengeance, understanding over judgment, and love over fear. The blessed spear would protect future generations from similar threats, but more importantly, the story of how it was earned would teach them that even the most ancient evils could be transformed through the patient application of wisdom, courage, and an open heart.